He didn't whisper it. He didn't hesitate. In front of 400 witnesses, captains, underbosses, allied family heads, and men who had buried bodies for the Viscari name, Cassian reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out the queen's necklace, and clasped it around Celine Voss's throat like it was nothing. Like the woman standing 10 feet away in a silver dress didn't exist. Like 22 years of marriage was a tab he'd finally settled. The necklace caught the chandelier light and blazed. Celine smiled the way a woman smiles when she has already won. And Lyra Ashbourne, wife, shadow, the quiet woman nobody ever looked at twice, stood perfectly still for 3 full seconds. Then she set her champagne glass down on the nearest table with a soft, precise click, smoothed the front of her dress, and walked toward the exit. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She didn't even look back. But every veteran underboss in that room dropped his eyes as she passed. Not in shame, in deference. Cassian saw it. He just didn't understand what he was seeing yet. If someone stripped away everything you'd built in silence, would you fight back, or would you let them believe they'd won? Before we go further, if you're watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Hit the like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now, let's begin. The Black Crest Syndicate Gala happened every year on the 15th of November, and it was never just a party. It was a census. Every man who attended was being counted, his loyalty measured, his debts quietly noted, his position in the hierarchy confirmed or quietly revised. The Vescari family had hosted it for 31 consecutive years, and in all that time the ritual had never changed. The Don and his wife entered first, the queen's necklace at her throat, and the room understood immediately who held the crown. This year, Lyra had dressed carefully. Not extravagantly. She never dressed extravagantly, but with the particular precision of a woman who understood that details were a language. The silver gown, the low heels, the single diamond at her ear. She had stood in front of the mirror in her dressing room for exactly 4 minutes, which was longer than usual, and she had looked at herself the way a general looks at a map before a battle. She isn't sure she can win. She had known something was coming. She simply hadn't known the exact shape of it. Cassian had been distant for 7 months. That was nothing new. He moved in and out of distance the way weather systems move through a city, and she had long ago stopped trying to predict his patterns. But 7 months ago, something had shifted in the quality of the silence between them. It had gone from the ordinary silence of 2 people who had run out of easy things to say to something with weight behind it. Something deliberate. She had noticed Celine Voss at the February fundraiser, a woman designed to be noticed, tall, constructed, with the kind of confidence that fills a room before its owner has crossed the threshold. Lyra had watched Cassian's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly when Celine laughed at something across the room. She had filed it away. She had been filing things away for 22 years. In the car on the way to the gala, Cassian had said almost nothing. His driver kept his eyes forward. The city moved past the tinted windows. Lyra had asked once whether he wanted to review the evening's seating, and he'd said, "It's handled," in a tone that meant he didn't want to talk. She had let the silence sit. Now she understood why. The moment itself had been almost surgical in its humiliation. Cassian had waited until the room reached its natural peak. 400 people, champagne flowing, the band playing something low and sophisticated, the energy of the evening at full brightness. He'd moved to the center of the floor, which was unusual enough that people turned. He had the kind of physical authority that made rooms reorganize themselves around him without anyone deciding to do it. 6'2", dark suit, silver at his temples, the Viscari bearing that his father had called the weight of the name. He'd raised his glass. People quieted. And then he'd said, in a voice that carried easily without being raised, "There are moments when a man has to be honest about where his future lies." Lyra had been standing 12 feet to his left. She'd heard the words and felt the particular quality of stillness that sometimes preceded catastrophic things, and she had thought, with one clear, cold part of her mind, here it is. He'd reached into his jacket. The necklace was a masterwork. 300 years old, commissioned by the first Vescari matriarch, a cascade of diamonds and sapphires on a platinum chain. So fine it looked almost liquid in the light. Every Don's wife had worn it. It had been placed around Lyra's throat on her wedding day by Cassian's mother, who had pressed her hands briefly and said, "This means you are the house now, not a guest in it." He had put it on Celine Voss. And the room had gone so quiet that Lyra could hear the ice settling in glasses 20 feet away. She remembered, in that moment, a conversation she'd had 8 years ago with Marco Valenti, the oldest of the underbosses, a man who had survived 4 regime changes and 2 wars and still managed to play chess every Thursday morning. He'd told her once, "The most dangerous thing you can do to an enemy is let them believe they've already won. Once they believe that, they stop being careful." She had thought about that conversation a lot in the past 7 months. She picked up her champagne glass. She set it down. She walked. The walk itself became something that men would describe for years afterward in terms that surprised them when they heard themselves use the words. Stavros Pell, who ran the Eastern waterfront operation and had been in the business since he was 19 years old, would later say that he'd seen 3 genuine power transitions in his career, and 2 of them had been quiet, and this was the quietest. Renata Moulin, who oversaw the syndicate's European money channels, and had dealt with Lyra exactly once in a professional capacity, a single phone call, 17 minutes long, during which Lyra had resolved a dispute that had been festering for 6 months, felt something she would struggle to name for weeks afterward. It was something between respect and unease, like watching an ocean pull back from a shore. The veterans dropped their eyes, not dramatically. Subtly, the way men do when they are observing a protocol so deeply ingrained they aren't consciously aware of following it. Cashin watched his wife cross the room. He watched the eyes drop. He watched the subtle reorganization of postures as she moved through the crowd. And for the first time in 7 months of careful maneuvering, he felt something he had not expected to feel. He felt uncertain. Celine's hand found his arm. Her fingers pressed slightly, a proprietary gesture that, under other circumstances, would have satisfied him. "Let her go," Celine murmured. "She's embarrassing herself with all that dignity." Cassian said nothing. The door closed quietly behind Lyra. The car that picked her up was not the family car. It was a black sedan registered to a holding company that did not list any Viscari name in its documentation. The driver was a compact, serious man named Aldrich, who had worked for Lyra for 11 years and had never once asked a question she hadn't answered. "Home?" he said, pulling smoothly into traffic. "No," she said. "Take me to the Harmon Street office." Aldrich nodded and said nothing else. The Harmon Street office was not an office that appeared in any Viscari business record. It occupied the 3rd floor of a building that officially housed an import consulting firm, and below that, a quiet insurance broker that had been operating at a modest and completely unremarkable profit for 19 years. The 3rd floor had no listing. The elevator required a key that existed in 4 copies, and Lyra kept one of them in the lining of her evening bag. She rode up alone. The doors opened onto a room that was not what the rest of the building suggested. Not modest, not unremarkable, but clean and purposeful and lit by a series of monitors that 3 people were already staffing when she arrived, despite the fact that it was past 10 in the evening. None of them looked surprised to see her. One of them, a woman in her 40s named Cress, who had a background in financial forensics and a specific talent for following money through structures designed to disappear it, handed Lyra a tablet without being asked. "He made contact with the Draven broker 6 weeks ago," Cress said. "Not Cassian directly. Through Celine's personal account, which we now have full visibility into." Lyra looked at the tablet. The figures were not small. "Victor Draven," she said, "not a question. His people. The man himself stays 3 layers back. He always does." Lyra scrolled. She didn't let any expression cross her face while she read, which took conscious effort because what she was reading was bad. Not merely bad in the personal sense. She had been preparing herself for the personal catastrophe for months, and she had gotten to a place where it registered more as confirmation than wound. Bad in the operational sense. Bad in the sense that someone had been maneuvering inside the structure she had spent years building, and they had gotten closer than she had known. "Who else knows this exists?" she asked. "In this room, the 4 of us. Outside this room?" Cress paused. "Theron Voss knew. That's why—" "Theron Voss was found in his car 2 days ago," Lyra said. "Yes." A quiet settled over the room that was different from the quiet in the gala ballroom. This quiet had a texture to it, something careful and sharp. "Then we move the timeline up," Lyra said. She set the tablet down on the nearest surface. She was still in her silver gown. She had not taken off her heels. I want the Draven Financial Network fully mapped by Thursday. Not partially, fully. Every holding, every front, every transfer route. I want names on the secondary and tertiary layers. Thursday is aggressive, Kress said. Thursday is necessary, Lyra said. Theron Voss is dead, which means someone knows the timeline is accelerating, which means we don't have the luxury of caution anymore. She paused. It also means someone inside the network told Draven about Theron, which means we have a leak in a place where very few people have access. The room was very quiet. I'll start pulling access logs, Kress said. Cassian did not sleep well. He'd left the gala early, earlier than planned, though he wouldn't have admitted that to anyone, including himself. Celine had wanted to stay. He'd told her he had business, which was the phrase that closed discussions, and she'd accepted it with the kind of practiced grace that he had once found attractive, and now, in some back corner of his mind, found slightly too smooth. He sat in his study with the lights low and a drink. He wasn't really drinking and thought about the eyes dropping as Lyra walked out of the room. He had been married for 22 years. He was not a sentimental man, and he had not been a faithful husband, and he had been honest with himself about both of those things in the privacy of his own head, though he would never have expressed them in those terms aloud. He had told himself over the past 7 months that what was happening was simply a man in his late 50s acknowledging a truth he'd avoided for too long, that he and Lyra had become two people who occupied the same house and operated in the same world, but had ceased, somewhere along the way, to have any genuine connection to each other. He'd told himself that story. He'd believed it. Now he sat in his study and thought about underbosses dropping their eyes, and the story felt a little thinner than it had. He called his head of security at 11:45. The man's name was Benito Coin, and he had the useful quality of not asking why. I want a full background pulled on my wife, Cassian said. Everything going back to before we met. I want it thorough, and I want it fast, and I want it done quietly. A brief silence. Of course, Benito said. And Benito. Cassian paused. If you find anything that surprises you, I want to know immediately. Not in a report, directly. Understood, Benito said. Cassian ended the call and sat with the silence of his study for a long time. The drink sat untouched. The house was quiet around him. He thought, she didn't even look back at me. He wasn't sure why that was the thing that bothered him most, but it was. The first thing arrived 4 days later. It came not through Benito's investigation, though that was moving forward, and already turning up anomalies that Benito had flagged with a careful neutrality that told Cassian the man was unsettled, but through an entirely different channel. An encrypted message arrived on the private line that Cassian used only for interfamily communications, from a contact he trusted completely, a man named Pharaoh, who served as the neutral channel intermediary for the allied families in the Northern Territories. The message was 3 lines long. The Altieri family has declined to recognize the transition of the Viscari First Lady position. Their statement uses the phrase, until the matter is clarified through legitimate channels. I thought you should know they're not alone in this position. Cassian read it twice. Then he called Pharaoh directly. What does that mean? He asked. The Altieri family has been aligned with Vescri for 15 years. The Altieri family is aligned with Vescari, Pharaoh said carefully. They simply have a position on the question of who represents Vescari. She's my wife, Cassian said. Whatever her position in the organization, Cassian. Pharaoh's voice was gentle in the way that meant he was about to say something the other person was not going to enjoy hearing. I'm going to tell you something as a man who has done business with your family for a long time and respects you. The captains don't have an opinion about your marriage. They have an opinion about the structure. They've been waiting to see how this resolves, and several of them, not all, but several, have been making quiet inquiries about how the organization functions if the transition happens to be premature. A long pause. Premature, Cassian repeated. That's the word they're using. Cassian thanked him and ended the call. He sat very still for a moment. Then he called Benito. How far along is the background investigation? He asked. That's actually why I was about to call you, Benito said. We've run into a problem. What kind of problem? Another pause, shorter, but with a different quality than Pharaoh's. Benito's pauses were not diplomatic. They were the pauses of a man trying to organize information that didn't fit into the categories he was used to working with. The kind where the further back we go, the less certain we are about what we're looking at, Benito said finally. There are financial structures connected to your wife that we cannot fully trace, not because the records were destroyed, because they were built in a way that I've only seen one other time in my career. When? Cassian said. When I was trying to trace the Sovereign's network, Benito said. About 12 years ago, when your father asked me to find out who had reorganized the family's accounts after the Brescia collapse. The Brescia collapse. Cassian knew the story. Every Vescari who'd been alive then knew it. His father had been dying, slowly, over a period of 2 years, and in that period 3 rival families had begun quietly dismantling the empire. The accounts had been frozen by external pressure. 3 major alliances had been on the verge of collapse. The organization had been weeks from genuine fragmentation. And then, almost overnight, it had stabilized. The accounts had been restructured through a series of moves that no one inside the family had fully understood. The alliances had held. The rivals had backed off. His father had died 14 months later with the empire intact, and Cassian had stepped into a structure that was, if anything, stronger than it had been before the crisis began. His father had told him once, near the end, "Someone reached in from outside and held the whole thing together. I tried to find out who. I never could." "You're telling me," Cassian said slowly, "that the financial architecture of the Sovereign and the financial architecture connected to my wife appear to be the same." "I'm telling you," Benito said, "that they share construction methods, signatures almost. It might be coincidence, but I've been doing this for 30 years and I don't encounter coincidences like that." Cassian's hand was very still on the phone. "Keep working," he said. "Tell no one." He put the phone down and stood at his window and looked at the city his father had left him and thought about a woman who had set down a champagne glass with a precise, quiet click and walked out of a room full of power without once looking back. He was beginning to understand that he had badly miscounted something. He just couldn't yet see the whole shape of what he'd gotten wrong. Celine came to him that evening with a glass of wine and a carefully arranged expression of concern, the kind she deployed when she wanted to signal empathy while actually extracting information, though he had only recently started to be able to see the mechanism beneath it. "You've been distracted," she said. "Business," he said. "Cassian." She set the wine down near him and sat on the arm of the chair across from his, the posture calculated to look relaxed. "I've been hearing things. From people I shouldn't have access to, but I do, because you trust me and they can see that. Some of the captains are getting nervous." "Captains are always nervous about something," he said. "Not like this." She paused. "They think Lyra is working against you, not openly. That's not her style, apparently, but quietly. Moving pieces. I've heard the name Theron Voss mentioned." Cassian looked at her steadily. "Theron Voss is dead." "I know," Celine said. "That's why his name is being mentioned." He watched her face. 11 months ago, that face had been a landscape he was only beginning to learn. Now he looked at it the way he was learning to look at things he didn't fully trust, carefully, with the part of him that was always calculating, always measuring, always asking, what is the gap between what I'm being shown and what's actually here? "Who told you about Voss?" he said. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "People talk." "Which people?" A very small hesitation. "Does it matter? The information is useful regardless of the source." He said nothing. He picked up his own glass and drank, and let the silence do work, and watched her manage the discomfort of it. Later, after she had left, he sat alone in his study and thought about the way she had not answered the question. He thought about Pharaoh's call and Benito's call and the memory of Theron Voss's name, which was a name he associated with the older network, the deep architecture, the foundation below the foundation. Only 3 people had known the Sovereign was real. One of them was dead. He picked up his phone. He had been planning to wait, to gather more before he moved, to be certain. But certainty had a cost, and the cost was time, and time was a resource he was no longer sure he had. He called Benito. "Where's my wife tonight?" he asked. A brief pause. "The Harmon Street building," Benito said. "She's been there most evenings this week. We've been monitoring from outside. I didn't want to attempt entry without your authorization." "Don't attempt entry," Cassian said. "Not yet. I want to talk to her myself." He paused. Tomorrow, he said. Set it up so I arrive without announcement. I want to see what she does when she doesn't know I'm coming. He ended the call. The night settled around him. Somewhere in the city, his wife was in an office that did not officially exist, working on something he had not known about, in a building that was connected to a network. He was only beginning to understand was far older and deeper and more significant than anything he had built himself. He had put a necklace around the wrong woman's throat in front of 400 people. He was starting to understand that this might have been the least of his errors. Cassian arrived at Harmon Street at 7:43 in the morning, which was earlier than Benito had recommended, and earlier than Cassian himself had planned. He hadn't slept. He'd been awake since 4, sitting in the same chair in his study, not drinking, not reading, just sitting with the particular restlessness of a man who has begun to understand that he has been operating inside a story that someone else wrote. The building looked like nothing. That was the first thing that registered. He had driven past this block 100 times in 22 years without his eyes ever catching on it. A mid-rise in a neighborhood of mid-rises, the kind of architecture that was designed, consciously or not, to decline to be noticed. The import consulting sign in the lobby window was the sort of sign that communicated exactly enough information to make anyone who read it immediately forget they had. He went in through the side entrance that Benito had identified. The elevator required a key. He'd had one made overnight, and he felt a specific cold quality as he inserted it. The cold of a man doing something he understands is irreversible. The third-floor doors opened. Lyra was at a standing desk at the far end of the room, her back to the elevator, in dark trousers and a gray sweater, her hair pulled back, looking at nothing like the woman who had appeared at 1,000 formal dinners in the past 2 decades. She was on the phone. She was speaking in a low, precise voice, and she did not stop speaking when the elevator opened, which told him one of 2 things. Either she hadn't heard it, or she had heard it and was choosing not to react. He suspected the latter. He walked in. 3 other people were in the room, a woman at one of the monitoring stations, a younger man running cables along the far wall, and a heavy-set man near the window with a tablet who looked at Cassian the way a dog looks at something it has been watching approach from a long distance and has already decided what to do about. None of them moved to stop him. Lyra finished her call. She set the phone down on the desk surface with the same deliberate quiet she had used to set down a champagne glass 4 nights ago, and she turned around. Her face showed nothing that he would call surprise. That was the thing that hit him first. Not her expression, but the absence of surprise in it. "You had a key made," she said. "Yes," he said. "It took you 4 days." He said nothing. She looked at him the way she had always looked at him in the last several years, with a measured quality that he had interpreted at various times as coolness or disinterest, or even the specific exhaustion of a marriage that had run most of its course. He understood now, standing here, that what he'd been seeing was something else. It was the look of someone who is always calculating and has learned to make the calculation invisible. "Sit down, Cassian," she said. "I'll stand." "Then stand," she said. She moved to the other side of the desk and picked up a tablet and handed it across to him. "Since you're here, you might as well start catching up." He looked at the tablet. He looked at the numbers. He was a man who understood numbers, had understood them since his father had begun teaching him the family accounts at 14 years old. And what he saw on this tablet required him to read it twice before he fully accepted that he was reading it correctly. The figures represented a financial network of a size and complexity that should not have been able to exist without his knowledge, should not have been able to exist at all in the shadow of his own organization without him having some awareness of its presence. "This is yours," he said. Not a question. "Parts of it," she said. "Some of it predates me. Some of it I built. Some of it was built around me by people who understood what it was for." "What is it for?" "Balance," she said. "The kind that doesn't make the news. The kind that keeps 37 families from killing each other over shipping routes and distribution territory." He set the tablet down. He looked at her. "For at how long?" "Which part?" "Any of it. All of it." She was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone searching for an answer. The quiet of someone deciding how much of the true answer to give. "The structure started before we met," she said. "Your father's organization was in collapse when I was introduced to it. Not to you. I wasn't introduced to you. I was introduced to the problem. By whom? Your father, she said. The word landed in the room and sat there. Cassian felt something shift in his chest. Not quite anger, not quite grief, something adjacent to both. My father never mentioned us. No, she said. He wouldn't have. That was the arrangement. I helped stabilize the network. In exchange, I remained invisible inside it. Your father understood that invisible was the only position from which I could do the work without becoming a target. And marrying me was part of that arrangement. A pause. Marrying you was my choice, she said, and her voice had a different quality for that sentence alone. Something underneath the precision that was harder to name. Not everything was arranged. He walked to the window. He stood with his back to her and looked at the street below and breathed through something that he didn't have clean language for. His father. His father had known. His father had gone to his grave having never said a single word. The sovereign, he said. The room was very quiet. People who needed a name used that one, she said. He turned around. 3 people knew the sovereign was real. One of them was just found dead in his car. Something moved across Lyra's face then, briefly, barely perceptible, but he was watching her with more attention than he had given her in years, and he caught it. It was not fear. It was the expression of someone who has already processed a piece of terrible news and has moved through the emotion of it into the operational implications, but in whom the original grief is still present, pressed flat beneath the surface. Theron Voss, she said. He worked for you. He worked with me, she said. He was the closest thing I had to a partner in the early architecture. He was also the only person in the network who knew Victor Draven by name. Cassian went still. Draven, he said. Victor Draven, she said, arms broker. He operates through 6 different corporate identities and 3 different jurisdictions. He has been buying access to the Allied family network for 2 years, through proxies, through pressure, through... She stopped. She looked at Cassian directly. Through your relationship with Celine Voss. The name hit him differently than he had expected. He had been preparing himself in some back corridor of his mind for the possibility that Celine was not exactly what she appeared. He had been preparing himself since Pharaoh's call, since Benito's findings, since the night he'd watched her manage the silence of his direct question about Theron Voss and not quite manage it well enough. But hearing Lyra say it was different. You're telling me Celine is working for Draven, he said. I'm telling you Celine was placed by Draven, she said. There's a difference. She may not know the full shape of it. Draven doesn't give people the full shape. He gives them the piece they need and lets them fill in the rest themselves. What does he want? He wants the Allied network fractured, she said. He wants the equilibrium destabilized. Because right now, the balance I've maintained means no single family can monopolize certain distribution channels, which means Draven can't control the pricing on what he sells. If the families go to war, and they will if the structure collapses, the demand for what he provides increases by a factor that makes his current operation look modest. Cassian was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his wife, whom he had publicly humiliated 4 days ago, whom he had spent 7 months gradually erasing from his life, whom he had married without knowing, or had told himself he hadn't known, and who was standing in an office that didn't officially exist, running an intelligence and financial architecture that made his own organization's capabilities look like a rough draft. Why didn't you tell me, he said. Because you didn't ask, she said. The words were quiet. They were not acidic, they were worse than acidic. They were accurate. He had not asked, not once, not in 22 years. He had noticed a brilliant woman and assumed the brilliance was decorative. Cassian, her voice shifted slightly, just enough. There isn't time right now for the conversation about the marriage. There really isn't. Draven knows his timeline is exposed because Theron is dead, and that means he's going to move before we're ready. He looked at her. What do you need from me? Something changed in her expression. Not softening exactly, but a small adjustment, like a door that had been almost completely closed opening by a fraction. Access to the security network through your people, she said. And you need to stop feeding information through your household channels. Celine has access to at least 2 of your regular communication routes. He absorbed that. How do you know that? Because I've been monitoring those routes for 4 months, she said, and I've watched specific pieces of information arrive in Draven's secondary accounts within 72 hours of passing through your household. He stood very still. You've been monitoring my communications. I've been monitoring the breach in your communications, she said, with a careful precision in the distinction. There's a difference, though I understand if that's not how it feels. He said nothing. Nothing. Cassian. Her voice was flat and clear. I know how this looks. I know what you think I am right now. But Draven's next move is the Syndicate Council, which is in 12 days, and if he hits it the way I think he's planning to hit it, people will die. Your people. And then the war starts, and once it starts, nobody in this network has the standing to stop it. He looked at the room, the monitors, the cables, the people who had been watching him with the patience of individuals accustomed to waiting out exactly this kind of silence. He looked at his wife. Show me what you have, he said. They spent 4 hours in that room. Cress laid it out in the methodical, effectless way of someone who has stopped expecting surprise from the people she's presenting to. The Draven network had been assembling itself for the better part of 3 years, moving through shell corporations and charitable foundations and 3 separate import businesses, 2 of which shared a registered agent with a company that also appeared in the background documentation of Celine Voss's modeling agency, which was not, as it turned out, quite as straightforwardly a modeling agency as it appeared. Cassian sat in a chair someone pulled out for him and absorbed information in the same way he absorbed it in any other operational briefing, with a stillness that was not passivity but concentration, asking precise questions at the points where the logic required them. Lyra stood through most of it. She stood the way she'd always stood at events, slightly back, observing, making small notes on a tablet. But here it was different. Here she was not background. She was the gravitational center of everything in the room, and Cassian watched the way the people around her oriented to her, not because she commanded it, but because they had learned that she was where the clarity was. He thought about 22 years. He thought about dinners where he had assumed she was not following the business conversations happening around her. He thought about moments when she had offered a single quiet observation, and he had noted it and moved past it. He thought about all the times the organization had stabilized after apparent turbulence, and he had attributed it to his own management, or to luck, or to the natural resilience of a structure that had been well built, by whom he had never thought to seriously ask. At noon, Cress stepped away to take a call, and the room had a brief lull, and Cassian stood and walked to where Lyra was standing near the window. The night of the gala, he said. He stopped. Don't, she said, not harshly. I need to sit. What you need to do, she said, turning to face him, is decide whether you're in or you're out. Not in terms of us, like, I'm not talking about us right now. I'm talking about whether you are going to work with me on this, or whether you are going to go back to your house and your communication channels and spend the next 12 days being fed information by a woman who reports to a man who wants this network in flames. He looked at her. I'm in, he said. Then call Benito Coin, she said, and tell him that as of today he takes operational orders from Cress. Not from you, not from anyone else. From Cress. It was a significant ask. Benito had worked for the Vescari name for 24 years and had a loyalty architecture that ran deep. Asking him to take orders from a woman whose existence he'd learned about 2 days ago was the kind of request that tested the walls of professional trust. Cassian called Benito. The call lasted 6 minutes. Cassian said less than he might have said in other circumstances, and Benito, who was, above everything else, a man who read situations accurately, said even less. At the end, Benito asked one question. This comes from you directly? It comes from me directly, Cassian said. Then I'll be there in 40 minutes, Benito said. Ito. The call from Stavros Pell came in at 2:15. Stavros was the Eastern Waterfront captain, the man who had dropped his eyes when Lyra walked out of the gala, and he called not Cassian's main line, but a secondary number that Cassian hadn't received a call on in over a year. I'm going to say this once, Stavros said, and I'm saying it because 30 years in this business has given me an instinct for when a structure is about to fall on someone, and I'd rather not see it fall on you. Talk, Cassian said. There's a meeting happening tonight, not a full council, a preliminary thing. 6 of the captains and 2 of the allied family representatives, and someone I was told is representing the neutral channel. He paused. I was invited. I declined. But I know where it's happening, and I know what the agenda is. And? The agenda is the question of legitimate succession, Stavros said. Specifically, who inherits authority over the network in the event of a leadership crisis. A silence. "They're not planning a crisis," Cassian said. It was somewhere between a statement and a question. "I don't think they're planning it," Stavros said. "I think someone told them one is coming and they're positioning for it." Cassian, the person representing the neutral channel, the one who called the meeting. "Who is it?" "I don't have a name," Stavros said. "But the description I got was a woman. Mid-30s, dark hair, came in through Draven's European channel 3 months ago." Cassian's hand tightened on the phone. He ended the call and looked across the room at Lyra, who was looking at him with the expression of a woman who has already read a situation and is waiting for another person to catch up. "Draven has a second contact inside the network," he said. "Someone who's been positioning with the captains." "Yes," she said. It was not the yes of someone who has just received information. It was the yes of confirmation. "You already knew." "I suspected," she said. "I've been trying to identify her for 6 weeks. She moves clean. Whoever trained her is good." "She's calling a meeting tonight," Cassian said, "with 6 of my captains." He watched Lyra absorb that. She was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. He counted, without meaning to. And in those 3 seconds, he could see her running the implications in real time, the same way he ran them, the way his father had done, the computational process of a mind that had been trained to see the shape of things before they fully materialized. "Then tonight changes everything," she said. The meeting was at a private dining room above a restaurant that Cassian's family had used for similar purposes 20 years ago and had stopped using because the owner had been connected to a period of friction with the Holt family, and it had since changed hands twice and now operated in a state of studied neutrality that made it attractive for exactly this kind of gathering. Cassian did not attend. He sent Benito instead, not to interrupt, not to be seen, but to observe from a position that Benito identified and prepared with 40 minutes of careful work. Benito was good at this. He was good at being in rooms without being in rooms. What Benito reported 2 hours later was this. 6 captains had attended. 2 allied representatives. 1 woman who had introduced herself by a name that was certainly not her actual name, and who had spoken for most of the meeting with the fluency of someone who had prepared extensively and knew the specific anxieties of each person in the room. Her central argument had been that the Vescari leadership was compromised, that Cassian had allowed personal weakness, she had used that specific phrase, personal weakness, to expose the network to outside pressure, that the necklace incident had been observed and interpreted by every allied family as a sign of fracture, all of which was accurate, and that Lyra Ashbourne, rather than the wronged party, was in fact the source of the destabilization, that she had been running a parallel power structure that answered to no one in the legitimate hierarchy, and that Cassian's own people didn't know the extent of it, which was also, in its way, accurate. But the woman, Draven's agent, had drawn from those accurate pieces a conclusion that served only Draven, that the network needed new leadership, and that she was present to facilitate the transition to a structure that would bring the allied families under a consolidated authority, which was what Draven had been building toward for 3 years. Cassian listened to Benito's report in full, without interrupting. Then he sat with it for a moment. "How many of the 6 are likely to move with her?" he asked. "2 are solid. 2 are wavering. 2 I couldn't read," Benito said. Cassian nodded. He looked across the room at Lyra, who had also been listening. Her face was very still. "The timing of Theron's death," she said to no one in particular. 12 days before the council. They needed him gone before tonight, so he couldn't warn us, which means they've had this timed for at least weeks, Cassian said. "Months," she said. "The whole thing. Celine, the gala, the captain's meeting tonight. It was staged. The sequence was designed." She looked at him. "The gala wasn't opportunistic. They needed you to humiliate me publicly. They needed the fracture visible." He said nothing. "Because if I was publicly stripped of my position," she continued, "any subsequent move I made to defend the network could be framed as personal. As a wife trying to take revenge, it removes my authority in advance." She said it with the same clean precision she said everything, but he heard something underneath it. Not self-pity, nothing as soft as that, but the weight of a woman who had just articulated how thoroughly she had been set up, and who had watched him participate in the setup without knowing he was participating. He had put that necklace on Celine Voss himself. He'd done it in front of 400 people. "Lyra," he said. "Not now," she said. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. The expression that crossed her face was the first one he had seen all day that was not controlled. "It's Cress," she said. She answered it, and he watched the color leave her face as she listened. And when she lowered the phone, her voice had the quality of someone speaking through a very narrow passage. "They found the second vault," she said. He didn't understand immediately. "What vault?" "The Ashbourne estate," she said. "Outside Milan. It's where I kept the physical documentation. The treaties, the original ledgers, the recordings." She stopped. "Someone hid it tonight. They went in clean. They took specific files. Not everything. They knew exactly what they were looking for. And they left." The room was very quiet. "If those files surface before the council," Cassian said slowly, "and they're framed the right way, then the Allied families see documentation of a parallel power structure that existed without their knowledge," she said, "presented by a source they've been primed to trust. And the conclusion that gets drawn is that I've been running the network for my own purposes, not protecting it." She looked at him with eyes that were flat and clear and very tired. "And then the war starts, and Draven wins, and every family in the Alliance tears each other apart, fighting over what's left." He stood up. "Then we have 12 days, he said. 11, she said. "After tonight, 11. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and between them was 22 years and a necklace and a publicly staged humiliation and a marriage he had been in the process of dismantling, and a network that was the only thing standing between 37 families and open war. And every one of those things was present in the room at once, jostling in the silence between two people who had run out of time to address any of it properly. "We work," she said. "Everything else waits." He nodded. She turned back to the monitors. He stood there for one more second, watching her, and thought, "I have been married to this woman for 22 years, and I have never once actually looked at her." Then he pulled out his phone and called Pharaoh, because there were captains who were wavering and only 11 days left, and the whole shape of the world was about to change, whether any of them were ready or not. The first thing Cress said when they pulled up the Milan estate footage was that it had been a professional job, and the second thing she said was that it had been too professional. "Look at the entry point," she said, and she pulled the timestamp back 40 seconds and let it run again. The camera was mounted at the corner of the estate wall, covering the northeast gate, and what it showed was a 6-second window in which the motion sensor should have triggered and did not. That sensor runs on a dedicated frequency, encrypted. The encryption key rotates every 72 hours, and the rotation schedule is held on a server that has no external connection. "So someone had physical access to the server," Benito said. "Someone had physical access to the server," Cress said, "which means someone was inside the estate recently enough to pull the current key, and recently enough means within the last 72 hours. The room was quiet. Lyra was standing behind Cress with her arms crossed, and her jaw set in a line that Cassian had never seen on her face before. Not anger, not grief, something harder than either, the expression of a person doing a rapid and painful accounting. "Who has access to the Milan estate?" she said. Her voice was very flat. "On paper, 6 people," Cress said. "You, Aldrich, the estate caretaker, and his wife, myself. And Theron Voss, whose access was never formally revoked because we didn't anticipate needing to. He was already dead." "Dead men don't pull server keys," Benito said. "No," Cress said, "but dead men have files, phones, associates who might have known what he knew." Lyra turned and walked to the window. She stood with her back to the room for a long moment, and Cassian watched the muscles in her shoulders work through something. And then she turned around and her face had reorganized itself back into the controlled precision he had been watching all day, though with a cost visible at the edges. "Pull every contact Theron made in the 30 days before he died," she said. "Phone records, in-person meetings, digital communications, everything. Cress, I want it cross-referenced against anyone connected to Draven's secondary network." "That's going to take time we may not have," Cress said. "Then start now," Lyra said. Cassian was already on his phone. He'd sent Pharaoh back to his own contacts with specific instructions, and now he was waiting for 3 calls that were overdue. He looked at his watch. It was almost midnight, 11 days before the Syndicate Council, and the physical documentation that represented decades of the network's foundational architecture was now in the hands of someone who intended to use it as a weapon. His phone rang. It was not Pharaoh. It was Celine. He looked at the screen for 2 full seconds, then looked at Lyra. She met his eyes and gave him a very small nod. He answered. "You haven't been home," Celine said. Her voice was calibrated to sound concerned while actually transmitting something else, an inquiry, a kind of careful radar sweep. "Business," he said. "It's running long." "Cash in." A pause. "I heard something today. From Stavros. He's been talking to people about the gala, about the way the veterans reacted when Lyra left. It's bothering him." "Stavros is always bothered by something," Cassian said. "He's saying Lyra has been running operations without authorization," Celine said. "He's saying it's been going on for years." Another pause, textured differently. She was testing the space between his words, measuring the density of what he wasn't saying. "Is that true?" "Where did Stavros hear that?" Cassian said. "I don't know. People talk." He said nothing. "Cassian." Her voice shifted, softer, with an intimacy that he had once found convincing and now heard as a kind of instrumental frequency tuned to a specific effect. "Come home. Whatever this is, we can figure it out together." "I'll be there in the morning," he said, and ended the call. He put the phone in his pocket and stood with his hand pressed flat against the top of the nearest desk, and breathed once, carefully, through the specific coldness of understanding something he had been resisting understanding. "She's checking on her intelligence," he said. "Yes," Lyra said. "She knows I'm not home, which means she knows I'm not at the office, or at the club, or at any of my usual locations, because she has visibility into my patterns." He stopped. "How long has she had that visibility?" "Since the beginning," Lyra said. "She was placed. The placement was thorough." He looked at her. "And you knew this when?" "I suspected it at the February fundraiser," she said. "I had confirmation at the 4-month mark." He did the arithmetic. "You had confirmation 7 months ago." "Yes." "And you didn't tell me." She held his gaze without flinching. "What would you have done with it?" she said. Not challenging him, asking him a genuine question that she appeared to already know the answer to, and whose answer she was not going to provide for him, but was going to let sit in the air between them until he provided it himself. He didn't answer, because the honest answer was that 7 months ago he had been building toward the gala night. He had been building toward the necklace. He had been in a state of mind in which information from Lyra would have been received as manipulation, and he would have acted on it accordingly, and Draven's agent would have had to adapt her timeline, and perhaps, the thought arrived cold and specific, he would have been handled in some more terminal way. "You protected me," he said. The words felt strange in his mouth. "By not telling me." "I protected the network," she said, "which includes you." It was not warm. It was not meant to be warm. It was simply accurate, in the way she was always simply accurate, and he stood with it the way a man stands with an injury he is only beginning to understand the full extent of. At 2 in the morning, Kress found the first name. It came out of Theron Voss's phone records. Not his primary phone, but a secondary device registered to an address in Stuttgart that Kress identified through 3 layers of corporate documentation as a property connected to a holding company that also appeared, 17 transactions back in a laundered chain, in Draven's European network. The name was not a name Cassian recognized, but Lyra recognized it. She stood very still when Kress read it aloud. It was such a complete stillness that Cassian, who had been across the room, turned to look at her before she said anything. "Say that again," Lyra said. "Marcus Sale," Kress said. "He appears in Theron's contact log 4 times in the last 3 weeks. Once for 42 minutes. The others were shorter." "Marcus Seal," Lyra said. The name came out of her mouth like something she was tasting for poison. "He doesn't exist in any of our network documentation." "He wouldn't," Kress said, uncertain of what she was watching. "If he's Draven's, he's not Draven's," Lyra said. She moved to the nearest chair and sat down, which was the first time she had sat down in hours, and the act of sitting had a quality to it. Not weakness, but the deliberate physical act of someone absorbing something large. "Marcus Seal is the name Theron used for himself in his early years, before he came into the network, before I knew him." The room processed that slowly. "It's Theron's alias," Benito said. "It was Theron's alias," Lyra said, "which means someone was calling Theron on a line registered to his own alias, which means someone who knew that alias existed was using it to reach him, And the number of people who would know that name, she stopped, is very small, Cassian said. Is me, she said, and two other people, one of whom is dead, and one of whom, she stopped again. Her hands, resting on her thighs, were very still. Pull the call logs on the other alias phones in that Stuttgart network, she said to Kress. I need to know if there's another device connected to the same account that made calls to a Geneva exchange in the past 3 months. Kress typed. The room waited. The results came back in 4 minutes. There was a Geneva exchange. 14 calls over 11 weeks. The last call had been made 6 days ago, 36 hours before Theron Voss was found dead in his car. Lyra looked at the number. Something in her face went through a transformation that was painful to watch, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so thoroughly contained. A woman trying very hard not to let something show that was showing anyway, in the small muscles around her eyes, in the slight forward displacement of her weight in the chair. That's Kress's number, she said. The silence that followed was of a different kind than any that had come before. Cassian turned to look at Kress. Kress was looking at the screen. Her posture had not changed. She was sitting at her workstation with her hands on the keyboard and her eyes on the data, and she looked for approximately 3 seconds like a person doing ordinary work. Then she turned her head and looked at Lyra, and what was in her face was not guilt exactly. It was something more complex and more awful. It was the face of a person who has been found and who has not yet decided how to be found. Lyra, she said. How long? Lyra said. Lyra, let me... How long, Kress? A pause. Kress's hands came off the keyboard. She placed them in her lap, one over the other, the gesture of someone who has stopped pretending to work. 14 months, she said. Lyra said nothing. She was looking at Kress with an expression that was absolutely flat, the way a landscape looks absolutely flat in the moment before an earthquake. 14 months, Cassian said. You've been feeding to Draven for 14 months. Kress looked at him, and for a moment something defensive moved through her expression. Then it settled into something tireder. Not to Draven directly. To an intermediary. I never... The effect is the same, Lyra said. Her voice was so quiet it was almost below the threshold of speech. I know that, Kress said. The Milan Vault, Lyra said. You told them the key rotation schedule. A pause. Yes, Kress said. And the captain's meeting tonight. Someone gave Draven's agent the names of the 6 most likely to waver. Someone who had access to my behavioral analysis files on each of them. Another pause. Smaller. Yes, Kress said. Benito had moved quietly to a position near the door. Not dramatically. He simply was not where he had been. Cassian saw it and said nothing. Theron, Lyra said. What happened to Theron? Kress's jaw tightened. I didn't know they were going to... What happened to Theron? He found out about me, Kress said. He called me 6 days ago on that line. He said he'd found the connection. He said he was going to tell you. She stopped. Her hands were pressing together in her lap, hard enough that the knuckles had gone pale. I told my contact that Theron had found the connection. I didn't tell them to. I didn't give them an instruction. I gave them information. That's what I was there to do. And Theron died 36 hours later, Lyra said. Yes, Kress said. The room was very quiet. Lyra stood up. She stood with the specific deliberateness of someone who is managing a physical response to something, the kind of careful movement that has rage underneath it, pressing up from below, being held down by considerable force of will. Why, she said. It was a simple word and she said it simply, and it was the most devastating word in the room. Kress looked at her. They came to me 2 years ago, before the 14 months. There was a period where they were just watching, building the approach. By the time they made direct contact, they had documentation on... She stopped. On my daughter. Her real name. Her location. She's been living under a protected identity for 8 years because of a situation from before I came to work here, and they had the full file. They said if I didn't cooperate, the people she was protected from would receive her current address within 24 hours. Nobody said anything. I couldn't... Kress started, and then she stopped. And the thing that had been pressed down under 14 months of professional function began to come up through the cracks. Not tears. She was not a person who cried, apparently, any more than Lyra was, but something close to its structural equivalent. I tried to limit what I gave them. I tried to give them things that were low value. I moved slowly. I thought I could manage it. Until Theron found you, Lyra said. Until Theron found me, Cress said. Lyra turned away from her. She walked to the window, the same window she had stood at twice before tonight, and she stood with her back to the room, and she looked at the city, which was doing what cities do at 2 in the morning, which is continue in its ordinary and indifferent way. Cassian watched her. He could see the back of her neck, the line of her shoulder, the very slight elevation of her breathing. He thought about what 14 months of compromised intelligence meant for the operational picture she had been building. He thought about how many moves she had made in that time that Draven had seen coming. He thought about the vault, the captain's meeting, the precision with which Draven's agent had approached exactly the right 6 men with exactly the right arguments. Draven hadn't been guessing at their vulnerabilities. He'd been reading their files. Lyra turned around. "Benito," she said. "Yes," Benito said. "Take Cress to the secondary location, the one on Callum Street. Not here, not anywhere she's been. Hold her there. She doesn't make contact with anyone." She paused. "She is not harmed. Is that clear?" "Clear," Benito said. Cress stood up when Benito approached. She stood with a kind of exhausted cooperation, like someone who had been carrying something for a very long time and was finally, in the worst possible way, putting it down. She looked at Lyra once more before Benito moved her toward the door. "I'm sorry," she said. Lyra looked at her. "I know," she said. It was not forgiveness. It was not cruelty. It was just a fact, acknowledged. The door closed. Lyra stood in the middle of the room that was now missing its most technically capable member, 11 days before the most significant event in the network's history, with the physical documentation of that network in enemy hands, and a strategic picture that had been read and countered in real time for over a year. Cassian stood up. "Tell me what we lost," he said. She turned to him. She looked at him for a long moment, and what was in her face was something he had not seen there before. Not defeat, something more specific than that. The look of someone doing a structural assessment of a building after a significant portion of its foundation has been removed, measuring in real time what can still stand and what cannot. "Everything I planned for the council assumed Draven didn't know my operational picture," she said. "He does. Every counter move I prepared, he's been read in on. Every approach I've built to the wavering captains. He knows which captains. He knows what I intended to use. He knows the timing." She stopped. "Which means the plan I've been building for 8 months is not a plan. It's a script he's already read." "Then we build a new plan," Cassian said. "In 11 days. "In 11 days, he said. She shook her head once. Not denial, but a kind of recalibration. "There's more," she said. "Tell me." She moved to the workstation Cress had vacated. She sat down, pulled the keyboard toward her, and began to move through screens. "The documentation they took from Milan," she said. Cress knew what was in that vault. She would have given them a full inventory, which means they didn't take randomly. They took specifically. They took the founding treaties, the agreements that established the neutral channels, the records that show the network's origin. "Why those specifically?" Cassian said. "Because at the council, the question of legitimacy is everything," she said. "If you can show that the network was established through one person's unilateral action, without formal family sanction, then it has no legitimate authority. It's a private empire, not a shared structure, and a private empire can be challenged." She looked at him over her shoulder. "If Draven presents those documents at the council with his framing on them, he doesn't need to win a fight. He just needs to get the families to vote on the question of legitimacy. And if the vote goes the wrong way, the network dissolves," Cassian said, "and he walks into the vacuum. With the only consolidated authority and the only standing army in the resulting chaos," she said. He came and stood beside her, looking at the screen she was building. A timeline, dense and branching, of everything that had been compromised and everything that remained. He looked at the shape of it. He looked at the gaps. "There's something he doesn't know," Cassian said. She stopped typing. 14 months of information from Cress," he said. "But Cress didn't know everything. You've been working in compartments. I saw that today. The filing structure here, the access levels. Cress had access to a significant portion, but not everything." Lyra was very still. "What doesn't she know?" he said. Lyra looked at the screen. "The secondary ledger," she said slowly. The one I've been building since the network stabilized. It's not the founding documents, it's the ongoing record. Every family's true financial structure, every hidden obligation, every leverage point. She paused. It's what the founding documents aren't. The founding documents show how the network was built. The secondary ledger shows how it actually runs. What everyone owes and to whom. Where is it? He said. She looked at him. In my seal, she said. Encrypted to a private key that doesn't exist anywhere that Cress had access to. Then that's what Draven doesn't have, he said. She turned back to the screen. He watched her think, actually watched it, in a way he had never watched anyone think before. The visible process of a mind moving through a problem at speed. Her fingers moved to the keyboard. She pulled up 3 windows simultaneously. If I can get that ledger to the right people before the council, she started. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. It was an unknown number, which on her phone meant something different than it meant on most phones. She had 6 contact categories. An unknown was a designation she had built deliberately to capture numbers that were known to the system but not to her personally. Numbers that had been flagged and monitored without her initiating direct contact. She looked at the number. She looked at Cassian. She answered on speaker. The voice on the other end was a man's voice, low and calibrated, with an accent that was mid-Atlantic in the specific way of someone who had been educated in 2 countries and trained out of both original accents. He spoke without preamble. You've had a difficult night, the voice said. I thought I should call personally. I've always respected efficiency, and I imagine you've been doing the accounting. Lyra said nothing. Cress was a resource, the voice said. Not an asset I particularly enjoyed. She had a conscience, which makes for unreliable work. But she served her function. I hope you weren't too hard on her. The situation with her daughter was genuine, incidentally. I want you to know that. I did not fabricate the threat. Victor Draven, Lyra said. A small pause. You know, you're the only person in this network who uses my name correctly, he said. Not Draven. Draven. 3 syllables. Everyone else mangles it. What do you want? She said. I want what I have always wanted, he said. A conversation. Before Thursday. A pause. I have your documents. I have your intelligence picture from the past 14 months. I have 6 families who are, at this moment, entertaining the question of whether your network has legitimate authority. Another pause. What I do not have, and I will be honest with you, because I respect you, is the secondary ledger. Cassian and Lyra looked at each other. I know it exists, Draven said. Theron mentioned it once, 4 years ago, and Theron was the most careful man I ever had to work her around. Which means if he mentioned it, it was real. Cress confirmed its existence, but not its location. You've been thorough in keeping it separate. A pause. I want to propose an exchange. I'm listening, Lyra said. I stop, Draven said simply. The captain's meeting last night was a preliminary move. It can be reversed. The documents from Milan can be returned. Draven interests step back from the network entirely. In exchange, you provide me the secondary ledger. So you can use every family's hidden obligations as direct leverage without needing to go through me, Lyra said. So I can operate in a stable market without going to war, he said. I'm a businessman, not a general. War is expensive and wasteful, and I lose as much as anyone in a fragmented market. This was never about destroying the network. It was about accessing it on equal terms. There are no equal terms between leverage and structure, she said. No, he agreed pleasantly. But there are practical terms. And in 11 days, when I walk into the council with your documents and 6 aligned families, the practical terms shift rather dramatically. I thought you'd prefer to negotiate from where you are now. She was quiet. You have until Thursday, Draven said. I'll be in touch. The call ended. The room was very quiet. The monitors hummed. The city continued outside the window. Cassian looked at Lyra and saw something he had not expected to see on her face. Not fear, not anger. Something almost worse than both, because it was the expression of a person who has run the numbers and arrived at a total that doesn't work, and who knows it doesn't work, and who is standing at the edge of a structure they have spent years building and watching the ground beneath it give way. He's right, she said quietly, about the practical terms. In 11 days, if he goes to the council with what he has, Don't, Cassian said. She looked at him. Don't tell me the math, he said. I can see the math. Tell me what's left. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, the ledger. And whatever allies I can reach who aren't already in his picture. She paused. And whatever you have that he doesn't know to account for. He looked at her steadily. What do you need me to do? She looked at him. Looked at him the way she hadn't looked at him in years, with the full weight of her attention, measuring something real. Then she said, I need you to call Stavros Pell, tonight. Not about the captain's meeting, not about the network. I need you to ask him one specific question. What question? Ask him who else was invited to that meeting last night, she said, and who declined besides him. He pulled out his phone. Cassian, she said. He looked up. After this, she said, there is no going back to any version of how things were. Not between me and the network, and not… She stopped. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. He held her gaze for 2 seconds. I know, he said. He called Stavros. And somewhere in the city, Victor Draven was sitting in a room with a folder of stolen documents and a phone and 11 days. And he believed, with the confidence of a man who had never yet been outmaneuvered in the final act, that he had already won. He had not yet accounted for what Lyra Ashbourne looked like when she had nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. Stavros picked up on the second ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. Who declined the meeting? Cassian said. No preamble. A pause on the other end. Not the pause of a man deciding whether to answer, but the pause of a man deciding how much of the answer to give. 4 others besides me, Stavros said. Renata Mulan declined. Pharaoh declined. 2 of the Allied family representatives from the Northern Territories, the Bascom side, they both declined. Why did they decline? Because they were called by someone who vouched for the meeting, Stavros said, and the vouch felt wrong. The person doing the vouching was introduced as a neutral channel contact, but she used a specific phrase, that the legitimate neutral channel stopped using 8 months ago. A protocol update. Anyone inside the real structure would have known it was outdated. Cassian looked at Lyra. She was already moving toward him, having heard Stavros through the speaker. Which phrase? Lyra said, loud enough to carry. A brief silence. The Ashbourne credential, Stavros said. She used it, which meant either she was inside the legitimate structure and hadn't been updated, or she'd gotten access to old protocol documentation and didn't know it had been rotated. She got access to old documentation, Lyra said. She looked at Cassian. Cress. The protocols Cress had access to were pre-rotation. She wouldn't have had the updated credential because I compartmentalized the rotation. Stavros, Cassian said. I need Renata Mulan, Pharaoh, and the 2 Bascom representatives on a secure call within 2 hours. It's 3 in the morning, Stavros said. I know what time it is, Cassian said. A pause. All right, Stavros said. I'll need a reason to give them. Tell them the Sovereign called the meeting, Lyra said. Another silence. Longer, heavier. I haven't heard that name used in 15 years, Stavros said quietly. Use it now, she said. The call happened at 4:40 in the morning, and it lasted 90 minutes, and by the end of it, Cassian's understanding of the previous 22 years had undergone a revision so complete that it felt less like learning new information and more like having the lights turned on in a room he had been navigating in the dark. Renata Mulan had known Lyra since before Cassian had. She had been the first external contact Lyra had brought into the early network architecture, and she had spent 15 years operating as one of its most significant nodes, while appearing, to every external observer, including Cassian, to be simply the competent and slightly severe woman who managed the European money channels for the Vescari organization. She had gray-streaked hair cut short, and the voice of someone who had spent decades being the sharpest person in any room she entered, and had long since stopped needing anyone else to confirm it. The Draven approach to my contact was made 7 months ago, Renata said, on the call. They came through a channel that should have been dead, a channel from the early network, before the restructuring, which tells me they've had archival documentation for longer than anyone realized. Longer than 14 months, Lyra said. Much longer, Renata said. Cassian. Her voice shifted slightly. I owe you a direct conversation. Several of us do. The network has operated alongside your organization for 20 years, and you were not read in. And I want to tell you that the decision not to read you in was not mine and was not Lyra's preference. It was your father's condition. The room was very quiet. His condition, Cassian said. He believed, and he was not wrong, based on the circumstances at the time, that the network's security depended on its invisible nature, that if you knew it existed, the people around you might eventually know it existed, and that the network's value was precisely that it couldn't be targeted. She paused. He also believed that you would be a good Don. He was right about that too. But he believed that a good Don and a man who could hold a secret of this magnitude for an entire career were different things, and he made his choice accordingly. Cassian sat with that for a moment. His father. A man he had buried 10 years ago with the specific grief of a son who had learned everything he knew from a person he had never fully understood. He sat with the grief of it now. Not the fresh grief, but the revised grief. The grief of understanding that the incomprehension had been structural and intentional. He protected me from it, Cassian said. He protected the network through you, Renata said. Which is not quite the same thing, but it's not entirely different either. Pharaoh spoke next, a brief, precise summary of what he knew about the captains who had attended the meeting and what their current posture was likely to be. 2 were probably committed to Draven's framing. 1 was persuadable. The other 3 were waiting to see which way the wind moved before the council, which was the most dangerous position because it meant they were available to whoever made the most compelling case in the next 10 days. The Bascom representatives, 2 brothers named Gael and Pitor, who ran territory in the northern corridor and had been allied family for 11 years, spoke last, and what they said was the thing that changed the shape of the room. 3 weeks ago, Gael said, we were approached through a legitimate Viscari channel with an offer. Not from Draven's side, from inside your household, Cassian. The offer was a restructured alliance agreement, better terms on the northern distribution corridors, in exchange for a vote of confidence at the council in a new leadership structure. Cassian's hand tightened on the phone. From inside my household, he said. The contact introduced herself as the designated representative of the new Viscari First Lady, Gael said. She had documentation with your seal, Cassian, a legitimate seal, not forged. Current. Cassian looked at Lyra. She was looking at him with an expression that was not surprise. Celine, he said. We didn't engage, Peter said. We declined and reported it to the neutral channel, which is how Lyra was notified. When? Cassian said. 8 days ago, Lyra said quietly. 8 days ago, 2 days before the gala. She had known, 8 days before the gala, that Celine was actively negotiating with allied families using Cassian's seal. He looked at Lyra. She met his eyes and didn't look away, and in the look was something that was not apology, but was its adjacent territory, the acknowledgement of a choice made under impossible constraints, in a situation where every option had a cost. She had known what was coming and had let it come, because stopping it prematurely would have collapsed the only evidence chain she had. She had let him put the necklace on Celine. She had walked out of that room knowing what she knew. He breathed. He breathed again. He turned back to the call. I need all 4 of you at the council, he said, not as observers, as principals. The next 9 days were the most compressed of Cassian's life, and he had lived a life that included 2 shooting wars, 3 regime transitions, and a period at 31 years old when he had personally held the Viscari organization together through a 6-month siege by rival families using nothing but nerve and calculation. None of that had felt like this, because in those situations he had always known with reasonable confidence what he was working with. He had known his assets, his allies, his intelligence picture. He had operated from the inside out. Now he was operating from the outside in, on a structure that had been running alongside his own for 2 decades, with a compromised intelligence picture, against an opponent who had 14 months of read-in time, with a team that was missing its most technically capable member, 9 days before a gathering that represented the single largest concentration of decision-making power in the criminal world. What he had was Lyra. He watched her work in a way he had never watched anyone work. She slept 4 hours a night, maximum, and he knew because he was sleeping on a cot in the Harmon Street office and woke repeatedly to find her at the workstation, the monitor light on her face, her hands moving with a quiet efficiency that had no wasted motion. She ate when someone put food near her and ignored it until the second or third reminder. She made calls at hours that suggested her contact network spanned every time zone simultaneously. She was precise, and she was fast, and he understood now, running the most complex operational recovery he had ever witnessed from a position of severe disadvantage. He worked beside her. He did what she asked when she asked it, which was a new experience for him and not a comfortable one. But he had made a decision in the room at 4:40 in the morning when Renata Moulin's voice described his father's reasoning, and the decision was this. He was going to be useful. He was going to set aside 22 years of being the center of his own operational picture and become, for 9 days, the person who supported someone else's. It turned out he was good at it. He had not known that before. On day 3, Benito brought news that changed the immediate tactical picture. Celine had left the Viscari house. Not dramatically. She hadn't packed visibly or made a scene. She had simply, over the course of a morning, moved the things that mattered to her into a car that was not a Viscari car and departed. Benito had tracked her to a property in the Eastern Hills that was registered to a company connected, through 4 layers, to Draven's European network. "She knows the timeline is accelerating," Lyra said when Benito reported it. "He's pulling his assets in." "She took something with her," Benito said. "From your study, Cassian, the secure phone, the one you use for council communications." Cassian went very still. "The council communication protocols are on that phone," he said. "Yes," Benito said. Lyra was already at the workstation. "How long ago?" "Approximately 6 hours," Benito said. "Then Draven has the council's secure channel as of 6 hours ago," she said. She turned to look at Cassian. Her face was tight. "Which means our communication with the allied families going into the council is potentially visible to him." "We go dark," Cassian said immediately. "We go dark, and we lose the ability to coordinate in real time," she said, which is exactly what he wants. If we're dark, we're blind. If we use the compromised channel, he reads everything we send. She turned back to the monitor. "There's a third option." She started typing. "We feed the channel," she said. "We use it, deliberately, to send him what we want him to know. We build a picture of our council approach that is convincing enough to pass, and we let him prepare his counter to a strategy we're not actually using." "A false picture," Cassian said. "A detailed false picture," she said. "Specific enough to be credible, which means it has to be built on real information, real names, real positions, real structural details, but arranged toward a conclusion that leads him in the wrong direction. If he sees through it, we lose what we were going to lose anyway," she said. "We're not in a position where caution is available to us." He looked at her for a moment. "Build it," he said. She built it over the next 2 days with Benito's help on the operational details and Pharaoh feeding real-time intelligence on family positions to give it texture. It was, Cassian thought, watching her work, a kind of dark artistry, the construction of a lie so densely furnished with real detail that it became indistinguishable from truth at the surface level. She fed it into the compromised channel in pieces, across 72 hours, at intervals that suggested organic communication rather than strategy. On day 6, something went wrong. Gail Bascom called at noon. His voice had a quality that Cassian recognized as the voice of a man managing extreme anxiety behind a surface of professional control. "There's been an incident at Renata Moulin's office," he said. "This morning. 2 men. They got in through the service entrance. Renata's security stopped them before they reached the inner office, but one of her people was hurt, and they left something behind." "What did they leave?" Cassian said. "An envelope," Gail said. "Addressed to Renata. Inside was a page from the Milan documents, the founding treaty between the Viscari network and the Altieri family, and a note that said, 'We have everything. What we do with it is still negotiable.'" Cassian relayed it across the room to Lyra without lowering the phone. She stopped typing. "He's not negotiating," she said quietly, to Cassian directly. "He's applying pressure. He wants Renata to pull back from the council to protect herself. If she pulls back, we lose our most credible voice on the legitimacy question." "Renata," Cassian said into the phone. "Are you there?" A pause. Then Renata's voice, slightly back from the phone, as though she'd been standing at a distance, listening. "I'm here. Are you pulling back?" A long silence. "Ask me again in 12 hours, she said, and the call ended. Those 12 hours were among the worst of the preparation period. Lyra worked without speaking, with a focus so intense it had a physical quality. Cassian made calls and received them, and coordinated and managed and did it all with the specific anxiety of a man waiting for a phone to ring that might deliver news that undid everything. Renata called back at midnight. "I'm not pulling back," she said, "but I need something from you." "Name it," Lyra said. "I need to know the secondary ledger is real," Renata said. "Not in the abstract. I need verification, something that proves it exists and that it contains what you say it contains. Because what I'm being asked to stake at the council is 20 years of my own reputation, and I will not do that on faith alone." Lyra was quiet. "Lyra," Renata said, "I trust you. I have trusted you for 15 years, but I need this." Lyra looked at Cassian. He nodded once. She pulled the ledger. Not the full document, a 3-page summary, specific enough to be unmistakable, covering 2 families whose financial structures were known to Renata from her own operational work. She encrypted it and sent it through a channel that didn't touch anything Cress had known about. Renata called back in 20 minutes. "I'll be at the council," she said. Oh. The morning of the council arrived gray and cold, the kind of November morning that seems to have been designed to make people feel the weight of things. The syndicate council was held at a fortress property outside the city, a compound that had been used for this purpose for 18 years, with security protocols that involved advanced teams, perimeter sweeps, and a strict communications blackout within the compound walls. Every ruling family sent a principal and a 2-person security detail, no additional personnel. The rules had been established by consensus and enforced by mutual interest, because every family understood that the council's value was its neutrality, and neutrality required that no single party could stack the room. Draven was not a family principal. He had no standing at the council directly, which meant whatever he planned to do through proxies inside the room. Lyra had identified 3 likely proxy voices among the attending principals: the 2 captains who had been at the night meeting, and a 3rd figure, a family representative from the Western Territories named Aldous Crane, who had appeared 3 times in Cress's compromised intelligence files, in contexts that suggested he had been receiving information he shouldn't have had access to. Cassian entered the compound with Benito as his security. Lyra entered separately, as she had attended previous councils, not as a principal, but as Cassian's designated operational advisor, a role that had existed for 15 years and that everyone in the compound had long since stopped registering as unusual, which was, Cassian now understood, entirely intentional. The first 90 minutes were procedural: the seating arrangement, the agenda ratification, the confirmation of quorum. 17 family principals around a table that had been in this room since before most of them had been born. Cassian sat at the position his father had sat in, at the position his grandfather had sat in, and felt the weight of the seat differently than he ever had before. He knew, now, what it had taken to build the structure that made this table possible. He knew who had built it. At the 90-minute mark, Aldous Crane raised his hand for a procedural motion. His voice was smooth and unhurried, the voice of a man who has been waiting for his moment and has spent considerable time preparing for it. "Before we proceed to scheduled business," Crane said, "I'm requesting that the council address a prior question, specifically the question of structural legitimacy within the Viscari organization and its implications for the network authority that Viscari has historically administered." The room shifted. 2 of the other principals exchanged looks. Several others went carefully still in the way people go still when they know something is happening and are not yet certain which way to orient. Cassian looked at Crane. "That's an unusual procedural request," he said. His voice was level. "It's a necessary one," Crane said. He reached into the folder in front of him and withdrew a document. The first of what Cassian could see was a substantial stack. "I have here documentation that I believe the council needs to review before we address any other agenda item." He placed the first document on the table and slid it to the center. Cassian recognized the seal at the top of the page. It was the founding treaty. "Milan, this document," Crane said, "represents an agreement that was executed without council ratification, without family consent, by a single individual operating under an assumed designation, who subsequently embedded herself within the Viscari organization without disclosure to the organization's principal." Every eye in the room was moving, between Crane and Cassian and the document on the table. "The network that has administered council relations for 20 years," Crane continued, was not built by the Viscari family. It was built unilaterally by an individual whose authority was self-designated. The question before this council is whether a structure of that origin can be considered legitimate under our collective charter. He sat back. The room was very quiet. Cashin looked at the document on the table. He looked at the faces around the table, calculating, uncertain, waiting. He looked at Crane, who had the expression of a man who has just made a move he believes ends the game. Then Cassian spoke. Before the council addresses that question, he said, I'd like to introduce a prior question, which is the question of how those documents came to be in Aldous Crane's possession. Crane's expression did not change. They were provided to me by a party who felt the council had a right to. Victor Draven, Cassian said. The name landed in the room like something physical. Two of the principals visibly stiffened. One of them, an older man named Breslin, who ran the Southern Territory and had been at these tables for 30 years, leaned forward almost imperceptibly. Draven, Breslin said, the arms broker. The arms broker, Cassian confirmed, who has been attempting to access this network's distribution architecture for 3 years through a combination of financial pressure, planted intelligence, and the deliberate destabilization of the Viscari organization's internal structure, including the placement of an operative in my household. He paused. The documents Crane has presented were stolen from a private archive by agents operating under Draven's direction, which makes this proceeding, if the council chooses to base it on those documents, a proceeding founded on material obtained through criminal action against a member family. Crane's composure cracked slightly. Not much. A tightening around the eyes, a fractional adjustment of posture. The origin of the documents doesn't affect their content, he said. The origin of the documents speaks to the intent behind presenting them, Renata Moulin said. Her voice was exactly as Cassian had always heard it, dry, precise, carrying the specific authority of someone who has never needed to raise it to be heard. An intent is not a small matter when we're discussing questions of legitimacy. Crane looked at Renata. Moulin, you have a direct interest in this question. You're part of the network being challenged. Yes, she said. I am. And I'll disclose that interest clearly, as the charter requires. She opened the folder in front of her. I'd also like to introduce documentation of my own into this proceeding. Specifically, a summary verification of a secondary financial ledger that documents the true structural obligations of every family currently seated at this table. She looked around the room. Every hidden debt, every obligation that doesn't appear in the official family accounts, every arrangement that has been made under the assumption that no one outside the arrangement had visibility. The room temperature changed. This ledger, Renata continued, has existed as a stabilizing mechanism within the network for 15 years. It is why the Council has functioned without a major interfamily conflict for that entire period. It is why distribution territories have held. It is why 3 separate attempts by external actors, Draven not being the first, to fragment this network have failed. Crane's voice had a new edge. Where is this ledger? Secure, Renata said. Who controls it? The same person who built the network that makes this room possible, Renata said. Crane stood up. The move was too fast. The composed timing gone. Something sharper and less rehearsed underneath. This is a manipulation, he said. Presenting a document that can't be verified. The doors opened. Not the main doors. The service entrance at the east wall, which should have been sealed and guarded. It opened with a controlled force that suggested the guards outside it had been managed, and 4 people came through it quickly, and the last one through was a woman in a dark jacket with a bruise forming along her left jaw and blood on her collar that was not from the bruise, and she moved with a physical precision that suggested the blood and the bruise had been acquired in the last 20 minutes and had not slowed her down. Lyra walked to the table. She put a drive on the table in front of Cassian. She looked at Crane. She looked at the room. My name, she said to the assembled principals, in a voice that carried without effort, is Lyra Ashbourne. I am the person who built the network you have been operating within for 20 years. I am the person Aldous Crane was attempting to discredit on behalf of a man who is currently positioned to profit from the destruction of everything in this room. She looked at Crane directly. And I am the person who has, on that drive, the complete unredacted secondary ledger, along with a complete record of Victor Draven's financial infiltration of this council, including the payments made to Aldous Crane over the past 18 months. The silence that followed was the most complete silence Cassian had ever heard in a room full of people. Crane's hand moved toward the inside of his jacket. Benito moved faster. The sound of a chair scraping back was loud in the silence, and then Benito had Crane's wrist, and the room reorganized itself in the sudden, sharp way that rooms reorganize when physical force enters them, and 3 other security details were on their feet, and for one suspended second the entire council balanced on the edge of something catastrophic. "Sit down," Cassian said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Crane sat down. Benito stepped back. Lyra looked at the room. There was blood on her collar and a bruise on her jaw, and she was breathing slightly harder than usual, and she stood at the table where the most powerful criminal families in the world were currently trying to process a situation that had moved faster than any of them had been prepared for. And she looked like someone who had been moving through fire to get to exactly this point, and had known, the entire time, that the fire was coming. "Victor Draven has people in this building," she said. "Right now. They were supposed to prevent me from reaching this table. They didn't." She looked at the drive. "The council has a choice in the next 10 minutes. Make it." Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She looked at the screen. It was a text from an unknown number, 4 words. "The building is wired." She looked up at Cassian. His eyes met hers. And the lights went out. The darkness lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds in a room full of people who carried weapons and had spent their careers operating in environments where darkness meant something specific and immediate and almost never good. 4 seconds in which Cassian heard breathing around him, controlled, some of it, and some of it not, and the scrape of chairs and the particular sound of hands moving to jackets, and somewhere to his left a woman's voice saying something sharp and low in a language he didn't recognize. Then the emergency generation kicked in, and the room came back in a dimmer, redder version of itself. And in that red light, Cassian looked immediately for Lyra and found her 3 feet to his left, already moving. She had the drive in her hand, and she was looking at the east wall with the expression of someone calculating structural variables in real time. She turned to Benito. "How many entry points to this room?" she said. 4, Benito said. He had his weapon out. He was the only person in the room who had produced a weapon, which meant his read of the situation was that they were past the point where visible force was a provocation. "East entrance, the one I came through," she said. "That's his primary entry. He'll use it, or he'll use the north service corridor, the one that runs behind the kitchen." She looked at Cassian. "He's not trying to stop the council anymore. The wiring message means he's moved past negotiation." "He's going to blow the building," Cassian said. "He's going to try to blow the building with every principle inside it," she said. "If every family loses its leadership in a single event, the network doesn't just fracture, it disintegrates. And in the disintegration, the only consolidated authority left is his." Around the table, the 17 principals were in various states of controlled and less controlled response. Breslin had his security detail in a tight perimeter. 2 of the younger family representatives were on their phones, which was useless inside the communications blackout, but was what people did when they were scared and needed the sensation of action. Renata Moulin was standing very still with her hands flat on the table, watching Lyra with the focused attention of someone waiting for instructions. Aldous Crane had not moved from his seat. He was sitting with his hands visible on the table surface, and his face arranged in an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and was not quite succeeding. Lyra looked at him. "Where are they coming in?" she said. Crane said nothing. "Aldous." Her voice was not loud. It was the kind of quiet that has weight behind it, the kind that makes people understand that the quietness is a choice and not a limitation. "People in this room are going to die if you don't tell me. Not enemy targets, not network principals. People you have sat at this table with for years." Crane's jaw moved. "I don't know the operational details," he said. "But you know something," she said. A pause. His eyes moved, briefly, barely, with the involuntary quality of a tell that a man tries to suppress and doesn't quite manage. They moved toward the north wall. Lyra turned to Benito. "North corridor," she said. Benito moved without acknowledging the instruction, which was the acknowledgement. "Everyone up," Cassian said to the room, in a voice that did not leave space for deliberation. "We move in groups. Security details stay with their principals. We exit through the main entrance, not the service entries, Breslin, you take the south group. Renata, the east cluster. Move now. The room moved. 17 principals and their security details in motion simultaneously had a particular quality of controlled chaos. People who were accustomed to operating under pressure, but not accustomed to operating under this specific kind of pressure. In the dark red light, in a building that might be wired, with an enemy they hadn't seen yet. Lyra stayed where she was until Cassian looked at her. Go with them, he said. No, she said. Lyra, the drive is what he's here for, she said. Second objective after the building. If he gets the drive, and I'm not here to contextualize what's on it, he can still use it. He can get out and reframe the entire council event as a Vescari-orchestrated attack and present the ledger on his own terms. She looked at Cassian. I have to stay, and I have to be visible, and that's not a discussion. He looked at her for 2 seconds. He wanted to argue. He looked at her face and understood that the argument was one he had already lost before it began, not because she had beaten him, but because she was right, and he knew she was right, and the knowing sat in him like something swallowed wrong. Then I stay, he said. She did not tell him not to. The north corridor breach happened 6 minutes after the room cleared. Benito had positioned himself and 2 of the remaining security personnel at the corridor entry, and he had done it well. Not in the open, not where an entry team would expect resistance, but in the architectural pocket formed by the junction between the corridor and the kitchen service access, which created a blind approach from the direction of entry and a clear sightline from the position of defense. The entry team was 4 men, which was professional but not overwhelming, and they came in with the controlled aggression of people who expected the room to be occupied and expected to manage it. They did not expect Benito. Cassian heard it from the main hall. Not the full exchange, but the compressed, ugly sounds of a close-quarters confrontation, the specific sonic texture of a situation in which there are not enough bodies for the violence to be clean. He moved toward it, and Lyra moved with him, which was not what he wanted and was what happened. It was over in under 90 seconds. Benito was standing when the sound stopped. One of the 2 security personnel with him was sitting against the wall holding his arm in a way that meant the arm was not working correctly. The entry team was on the ground in various configurations. Benito looked at Cassian. His lip was split, and there was something wrong with his breathing. Not dramatically wrong, but the slightly effortful quality of a man who had taken something to the ribs and was managing the information. One got past me, he said, back through the corridor. He was the one carrying the detonator equipment. Lyra was already moving back toward the main hall. Where would you place it? She said, to no one in particular, or to herself, speaking the question aloud as a way of working through it. Not in the room. He didn't have access to the room until tonight, and he would have needed time, the structure. She stopped walking. She looked up. The building's original construction has a load-bearing column system, 4 primary columns. If you want maximum structural failure with minimum device placement, you target the northeast and southwest columns. They're offset. Compromising both creates a diagonal collapse that takes out the center. Where are the columns? Cassian said. She moved. He followed. Through the main hall and into an adjoining corridor that smelled of old stone and the particular mustiness of a building that had been repeatedly patched over centuries, past a door that led to a utility access space that Cassian had never had reason to enter in 18 years of attending councils in this building. The utility space was low-ceilinged and lit by a single functioning emergency light, and at the far end of it, at the base of what was clearly a structural column, a man was kneeling with a canvas bag open beside him and his hands inside it, working quickly. He heard them and came up turning, and he was fast, professionally fast, the kind of fast that came from training and repetition. And he had the detonator unit in his hand and his thumb on a switch that was not the main trigger but was clearly its predecessor, the arming switch. And if his thumb finished its travel, the device at the base of the column would become active, and any subsequent signal would end the building. Cassian shot him. He shot him once, in the shoulder of the arm holding the detonator, which was not the center mass shot that ended situations cleanly, but was the only shot available without risking the detonator completing its travel. And the man went down sideways, and the detonator hit the floor, and Lyra was on it before it finished sliding, her hand over the switch, her knee on the man's wrist. The switch had not completed its travel. The device was not armed. Lyra knelt on the floor of a utility corridor with her hand over a detonator and her knee on a wounded man's wrist, and she breathed, once, carefully, with the deliberate quality of someone re-establishing a baseline. And then she looked up at Cassian. He was still in the posture of the shot. His hand was steady. His breathing was not. "Northeast column," she said. "There's another one." He went. He found it without her, which was harder, because the northeast column access was through a different utility entry, and he took a wrong turn in the dark, and corrected, and took another wrong turn, and the whole time the back of his mind was running the arithmetic of time against consequence, with a focus so narrow it excluded everything that was not the immediate problem. There was no second man at the northeast column. There was a device, already placed, already wired, connected to a receiver unit that would take a wireless signal. But the man who had placed it was not present, which meant he had placed it earlier, which meant it had been in the building for some amount of time before any of them had arrived. Cassian looked at it. He was not a demolitions expert. He knew enough to understand the architecture of the thing, the receiver, the initiator, the charge itself, and he knew enough to understand that what he was looking at was not an improvised construction, but a professional one, which meant it had been assembled with internal redundancies, and that pulling components at random was not a strategy. He called Benito. Benito talked him through it in 35 seconds, in the flat, specific language of a man who had encountered this type of device before and remembered the construction sequence well enough to reverse it. And Cassian's hands did what Benito's voice told them to do. And when it was finished, the device was inert on the floor, and Cassian was kneeling next to it with his hands not quite steady and the specific adrenaline clarity of a person who has just done something with no margin. He sat back against the column and breathed for 10 seconds. Then he got up. Victor Draven was in the main hall when Cassian got back to it. He had not come in through a breached entry. He had come in through the main entrance, which meant he had been outside the building and had entered through the front when the security perimeter broke down during the evacuation, taking advantage of the controlled chaos, walking in through a door that was no longer being watched because the people watching it had other priorities. I was not what Cassian had pictured. He was a compact man in his early 60s, gray-suited, with the kind of unremarkable face that became invisible in any crowd. The face, Cassian thought, of a man who had spent a career being underestimated and had built his entire methodology around that fact. He was standing in the center of the main hall with two men flanking him, and he was looking at Lyra, who had come back from the utility corridor and was standing 12 feet away with the drive in her hand and blood on her collar and a bruise on her jaw that had darkened to a deep purple in the last hour. They were looking at each other the way people look at each other when they have been in opposition for a long time without ever being in the same room. "The devices didn't detonate," Draven said. He said it without particular emotional register, the way a man notes a variable. "No," Lyra said. "The council principals are outside." "Yes." He looked at her. "The drive," he said. "The drive," she agreed. "I'd like to make you an offer," he said. "You made me an offer 11 days ago," she said. "I didn't take it then either." "That offer assumed I had more leverage than I currently have," he said. He was not a man who performed emotions he didn't have, apparently. There was no rage in him, no wounded pride, nothing that resembled the villainous register. He simply assessed and spoke. "The current offer is simpler. Walk away. Both of you. Take the drive. The network continues under whatever structure you choose. I withdraw completely from every channel I've built into it." "In exchange for what?" Cassian said. He had moved into the hall from the corridor entrance and was now part of the geometry of the room, which had reorganized itself around 3 points of gravity: Draven, Lyra, and Cassian. Draven looked at him. "In exchange for the understanding that neither of us pursues the other," he said, "I lose this operation. I accept that. I walk away clean." "You had Theron Voss killed," Lyra said. Something moved in Draven's face, not guilt, something colder than guilt. "Theron became a liability to the operation." "Theron was a person I worked with for 15 years, she said. "He was not a liability. He was a man." "In this business," Draven said, "the distinction is often temporary." "No," she said, "in your business, not in mine." Draven looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "The offer is on the table." "The offer was never on the table," she said, "because accepting it means you walk away with your network intact, your channels, your infrastructure, your next approach to the next target, and the one after that." She looked at him steadily. You had Cress's daughter threatened. You had Theron killed. You placed a woman in my husband's life for 7 months and used her to strip my standing in front of 400 people. And you think the offer I'm going to take is the one where you go home. Draven's two men had shifted slightly in the way that security personnel shift when they are recalculating the likelihood of needing to act. Benito stepped into the hall from the south entrance. Draven saw him. He looked at Benito, and he looked at Cassian, and he looked at Lyra, and he did the arithmetic that a man in his position does when the geometry of a room has moved against him. He was not a man who panicked. He was a man who calculated. "You don't have the authority to hold me," he said. "This is not a law enforcement operation." "No," Lyra said. "It's a network operation." She looked at him. "And the network has a protocol for people who attempt to destroy it." "Which is what, precisely?" "Exposure," she said, "not violence. I'm not interested in violence against you. I'm interested in making sure that every arms purchasing authority in every jurisdiction where you operate has a complete and documented picture of your organizational structure, your financial routing, and your methodology." She held up the drive. "It's all here. Your side of it and mine. Everything Cress passed to your network over 14 months, cross-referenced with your own financial architecture, which I've been mapping independently for 8 months. She paused. "You'll spend the next 10 years managing the consequences. Maybe longer." Draven was quiet. "It's not clean," she said. "It's not fast, but it's thorough. And you don't walk away from thorough." She looked at the drive one more time, then set it down on the long table in the center of the hall with a quiet, precise click. Draven looked at it. He looked at Lyra. He looked at the room around him, and he looked at the arithmetic, and he was a man who had built his entire life on reading situations correctly and extracting himself from the ones that had gone irrecoverably wrong. "Make the call," he said to one of his men. The man reached for his phone. "Don't," Benito said. The man looked at Benito. Benito's expression was the expression of a man who has already decided how the next 5 seconds go and is simply waiting for the other person to catch up. The man put his phone away. Draven looked at Lyra once more. It was a long look. Not threatening, not pleading, the look of a man filing something into a category and closing it. "You've been a remarkable problem," he said. "I know," she said. He was taken into custody by Stavros and Pharaoh, who had come back into the building with 4 additional security personnel when Benito sent the all-clear signal, and who managed the handover with the kind of professional efficiency that came from 2 men who had been in this business long enough to have no remaining appetite for the dramatic. Cassian watched it happen. He stood in the main hall of a building that had almost come down around everyone in it, and he watched the man who had spent 3 years dismantling the architecture of 20 walked out between 2 people who were part of that architecture, and he felt something settle in his chest that was not satisfaction and was not relief, but was something quieter than either. The particular stillness that follows the end of a thing that has required complete and sustained attention. He turned to look at Lyra. She was standing at the table with her hand resting lightly near the drive, not touching it, just near it, and she was looking at a middle distance that was not any specific point in the room. Her jaw was bruised and her collar was stained, and there was a small cut above her left eye that she had not mentioned and that had dried without being tended to, and she looked, not beaten, nothing close to beaten, but the specific exhaustion of a person who has been running at full capacity for 11 days and has just passed the point where the capacity was required. She looked human, in a way that he realized, standing there, he had not permitted himself to see in a very long time. Celine was detained at the property in the Eastern Hills the following morning. She did not resist. She sat in the back of a car with Benito's people and looked out the window with the expression of a woman who had been running a long calculation and had recently arrived at a total she didn't like. She asked, once, to speak with Cassian directly. Cassian went. They sat across from each other in a bare room with a table between them, and she looked at him with something that was not quite the face she had shown him over the past 11 months. The beauty still there, but the architecture beneath it different, now that the performance had a different purpose. "I didn't know about the building," she said. "The wiring. I want you to know that." "I believe you," he said. And he did. Draven compartmentalized. He had given Celine enough to do her job and nothing beyond it. "I thought—" She stopped. She looked at her hands on the table. "I thought it was a business operation. That's how it was presented to me. A restructuring play." Get inside the Viscari organization, help position the leadership transition, take a percentage of the new arrangement. She paused. I didn't think anyone would get hurt. Theron Voss got hurt, Cassian said. She said nothing. You used my seal, he said, to negotiate with the Bascom family. I was told you'd authorized... She stopped. She heard herself. I was told a lot of things, she said, quieter. He looked at her. She was not a villain, he thought. She was a woman who had been recruited into something she'd understood partially and had told herself the partial understanding was enough. People did that. People told themselves that not knowing the whole shape of a thing meant they bore no responsibility for the whole shape of a thing. There'll be a process, he said. Legal or close to it. The network has protocols. She looked at him. And us? There was no us, he said. There was an operation that looked like us. I know the difference now. He stood up. He looked at her once more, not with cruelty, not with warmth, with the honest neutrality of a man who has fully closed a door and knows it. And then he left the room. The council resumed 4 days later, in a different location, with additional security protocols that Lyra helped design in the 72 hours between the first session and the second. Aldous Crane did not attend. He was managing the beginning of a series of legal consequences that the drive had made possible in 3 separate jurisdictions. The question of legitimacy was raised again, not by a Draven proxy this time, but by Breslin, which was different, because Breslin was not an enemy and was not operating in bad faith. He raised it the way a veteran raises uncomfortable questions, because they have to be addressed, not because addressing them is comfortable. The network's origin matters, Breslin said. Not because we want to dismantle it, because going forward, whatever we ratify should be ratified clearly, by everyone in this room, not inherited, chosen. He looked at Lyra, who was seated at the table for the first time in any council's history, not as an advisor, not as an attendant, but as a principal, which had required a procedural motion that Cassian had made and Renata had seconded and which had passed with a majority that was not unanimous but was clear. I have no objection to ratification, Lyra said. I built the network to serve the Alliance. If the Alliance wants to formally claim it, I welcome that. What I'm proposing is not ownership. It's a charter. Agreed terms. Obligations that run in every direction. And the ledger, Breslin said. Remains in trust, she said. Not with me alone. A 3-person council of custodians, rotated on a 5-year term, drawn from different regions. No single family has access. The leverage it contains is a stabilizing tool, not a weapon. That's been true for 15 years and I want it codified. The room was quiet for a moment. And the Vescari family's administrative role, Pharaoh said. Going forward. Lyra looked at Cassian. Cassian looked at Lyra. Shared, Cassian said. The administrative function runs jointly, or it doesn't run with Vescari standing behind it. He paused. That should have been true from the beginning. It's true now. The vote that followed was not unanimous either. 2 families abstained, 1 voted against, the rest voted in favor, and the charter motion carried, and the network that Lyra had built in secret in a period of crisis 22 years ago became, for the first time, a thing that existed with the explicit knowledge and consent of the families it served. It was not a triumphant moment. It was a practical one, which was, Cassian thought, appropriate. 3 weeks after the council, Cress was brought from the Callum Street property. Lyra met with her alone, which Cassian had offered to attend, and which Lyra had declined with the specific quiet of a person who understood that some accounting had to happen between the right parties without witnesses. He didn't know what was said in that room. He knew the meeting lasted 2 hours. He knew that when Cress left, her daughter's protected identity had been relocated to a new address through a network channel that Draven's people no longer had any access to, and that Cress herself had agreed to a supervised cooperation arrangement that would take years to complete. He knew that Lyra came out of the room looking the way people look after they've done something that cost them something real, and that she didn't talk about it, and that he didn't ask. He had learned, in the past several weeks, that there were things Lyra processed alone, and that pushing into those spaces was not support. It was demand dressed as concern. He had done that for 22 years without knowing he was doing it, which did not excuse it, but was at least an understanding he now had that he hadn't had before. The necklace. It had come back to the house in the period after the council, delivered in a plain envelope by Stavros, who had retrieved it from the property in the Eastern Hills during Celine's detention. No note, just the necklace, in a small cloth bag, placed on the front table in the entry hall of the Vescari house. Cashin picked it up one evening and held it. The diamonds caught the hallway light, same as they always had. 300 years of weight in his hand. Lyra came in from the study and saw him holding it. She stopped in the doorway. He looked at her. He held the necklace out across the space between them. Not with ceremony, not with performance, just held it out the way you hold something out when you want to give it back to its rightful place. She crossed the room. She didn't take it from his hand. She stood close to him, which was something that had not happened simply or without self-consciousness in longer than either of them could precisely identify. And she looked at the necklace in his palm. It was always a symbol, she said. I know that now, he said. Symbols matter, she said, but they're not the thing itself. No, he said, they're not. She reached out and took the necklace from his hand and looked at it for a moment, really looked at it, the way you look at something you've had a complicated relationship with, something that has been a point of pride and a target and a wound and a history all at once. Then she walked to the study, and he heard the sound of the small cabinet near the window opening and closing, which was where she kept things that mattered but did not need to be displayed. She came back without the necklace. He looked at her. What happens now? He said. She looked at him with the expression she had been wearing for 22 years, the one he had misread as distance, as coolness, as the particular affect of a woman who had run out of feeling for her marriage. He understood now that what it was, had always been, was measurement. Not of him against some standard he didn't know about. Just measurement, the way a structural engineer measures, constantly, quietly, because the alternative is to stop paying attention, and she had never in her life been able to stop paying attention. Now is harder than the crisis, she said. The crisis has a shape. You know what you're solving for. And now we don't know, he said. Now we figure it out, she said, which takes longer. I have time, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Something moved in her face, not the small adjustments of a controlled person managing their expression, but something that came from a level below control, brief and real, and then held, as was her way, behind the precision. You have things to answer for, she said, separately from the crisis, separately from Draven and Celine and the council. Things that were just between us. I know, he said. That conversation doesn't happen tonight, she said. I know that too, he said. She nodded. She looked at him once more, directly, the way she had begun to look at him in the Harmon Street office, with the full weight of her attention rather than the managed portion. And then she moved past him toward the kitchen, which was where she went when she was processing things and needed the ordinary physics of making tea to give her hands something to do. He stood in the hallway for a moment, in the house that had felt like a stage set for most of a year, and was beginning, slowly, to feel like a place where people lived. He thought about his father, about a dying man who had reached outside his own collapsing empire and found a person capable of holding it together, and had asked her to do it invisibly, permanently, without credit or acknowledgement, because he had believed that was what the situation required. He thought about whether his father had been right. He thought it was possible to be right about a thing and wrong about a thing at the same time, and that his father had been both, and that it was too late to tell him either. He thought about 22 years of not looking at the person standing next to him. He thought about the specific texture of learning to look. From the kitchen, there was the sound of water running, and then the small percussion of a kettle being set down, and the ordinary sounds of a person moving through a room without performing anything for anyone. He walked toward the sound. Outside, the city was doing what it always did. Continuing, indifferent, vast, full of the 10,000 ordinary things that happened in it every night, while the people inside it were trying to find their way through the consequences of their choices. The necklace was in a cabinet. The network had a charter. Draven was in the beginning of an ending that would take years and would not be clean. And in a house on the north side of the city, two people who had been standing on opposite sides of a silence for 22 years were, with difficulty and without any guarantee of outcome, beginning to cross it. That was not a fairy tale ending. It was not the kind of ending that wrapped things cleanly or resolved what years of misdirection and neglect had accumulated between two people. It was the kind of ending that was also a beginning, which was the only honest kind, which was the kind that cost something and meant something and had no guarantee attached to it, which was, in the end, the only kind either of them had ever known how to live.